In 1619, African slavery was introduced into the Americas. Over the next few decades, the triangular slave trade forced millions of Africans into bondage and began one of the worst eras of American history. For the next few centuries, race-based chattel slavery became the dominant factor of American society until the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which liberated African Americans in the United States. Though the practice of slavery has been long outlawed across the U.S., consumers today are still indirectly supporting and propelling the practice through the purchase of products that rely on a supply chain built around the exploitation of labor, of children, and adults.
Many popular products come from unethical sourcing in countries that utilize African slave labor. The farms of Western Africa supply cocoa to international giants such as Hershey's, Mars, and Nestle, revealing the industry's direct connection to the worst forms of child labor, human trafficking, and slavery. Although many consumers may not realize it, by purchasing products from these companies, consumers support the practice of unethical slave labor. Consumers' indirect support of these companies is a major factor that allows these unethical practices to continue today.
Researchers estimate that 40 million are enslaved worldwide, generating $150 billion each year in illicit profits for traffickers. The people in Western Africa experience extreme poverty levels in comparison to the rest of the world. The children grow up in families who do not make enough money to supply food to everyone. So if the children haven't already been abducted by traffickers or sold to traffickers by their own relatives, the children go themselves and leave their families behind, because they were tricked into believing they would be paid well or even at all. After leaving, these children will not be able to see their families again. From there, these children are then given extremely dangerous jobs like cutting trees with chainsaws and machetes, carrying 100-pound bags of cocoa through the forest, spraying hazardous pesticides, and potentially slicing their hand open from striking the machete to open the cocoa bean. The majority of the children already have scars in their hands, arms, or shoulders from the machetes.
These obstacles tragically limit developing third world countries in areas such as education. For example, this slavery contributes to the low levels and quality of education in countries such as Africa, being that West Africa has some of the lowest literacy rates in the world. Lack of access to quality education means that cocoa farmers and adults in cocoa growing communities remain uneducated and unskilled, further exacerbating cycles of poverty. Not only does this unfair treatment of African slaves contribute to the continuing lack of education for cocoa farmers and workers, but as a result, it negatively affects the increasing rate of intense poverty in Africa. Without the necessary education and skills needed to obtain a better job with better wages, cocoa farmers and slaves are trapped in this ongoing cycle of poverty.
The reality of modern-day slavery is shocking to most. Many fail to fathom how arguably the most free time in history is still being ravaged by inhumane institutions. The truth becomes clear as one takes a closer look at the relationship between the big candy companies and farmers. The low wages, just $2 a day, given to many cocoa farmers not only set them below the poverty line, but also tempt them to resort to the cheapest labor they can find, wageless child and slave labor. While the practices of farmers cannot be morally justified, observers can sympathize with the tough circumstances. Because of the desperate needs of many of the farmers, ending modern-day slavery has to start with the big corporations. The companies of the cocoa industry should only receive consumer support when they lay down their corporate greed, exchange it for cocoa from slave laborless farms, and begin paying the cocoa farmers a suitable wage. Understandably, companies still seek a profit, but within their $60 billion industry, chocolate companies have the power to end the use of child labor and slave labor by paying cocoa farmers a living wage for their product. If companies are not more responsible with their sourcing, they are facilitating slave labor, and if consumers support this corrupt cocoa exchange, they allow for the continuation of a selfish and subhuman industry.
Besides the moral dilemma of modern-day slavery, legal action has been taken to help inform consumers of their part in the unethical industry. The 2010 California Transparency in Supply Chains Act required that companies disclose their effort to combat labor exploitation, but did not require that the products must be labeled as having been possibly produced by child or slave labor. A 2012 ruling by the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco deemed that companies need only disclose their labor practices if it has caused an unreasonable safety hazard to its consumers. Various other California rulings allowed for broader labeling requirements using ambiguous phrases such as reasonable consumer and product central function to to loosen the connection between companies and the uncertain origins of their supply chains. Open-ended rulings such as these that allow for the origins of products to remain hidden contribute to the ambiguity of consumers' goods. Chocolate is arguably the most beloved and popular confectionery product in the world, and is therefore an industry that has no threat of dying. With a guaranteed market demand, there is only room to improve, starting with the origins of these cocoa products. So what are companies like Hershey's and Mars doing to eradicate the issue of child and slave labor? Hershey's, with an annual profit of over $7.7 billion US, expends $500,000 for its Cocoa for Good strategy, with missions to increase access to nutritious foods, eliminate child labor, economically empower women, and increase agroforestry and shade-grown cocoa. While this all sounds as if the fight against labor exploitation is supported by these large corporations, neither Hershey's nor Mars discloses what exactly is being done to achieve these goals. With profits only increasing, multi-billion-dollar companies can do so much more to end the suffering of children and families forced to slave on cocoa farms.
Although ending modern-day slavery starts with the companies, it is also the job of the consumer to not support companies that irresponsibly source their cocoa.
Organic and fair trade companies are good alternatives to buy chocolate from because they get their cocoa supply through more humane methods by not using pesticides, abusing animals, and most importantly, not participating in any form of slave labor. Though, no pun intended, this can come at a cost. Organic and fair trade companies are oftentimes way more expensive than the companies involved with slavery. Not just the cost, but because the consumer industry is so complex, it can be hard to really know where your food comes from without extensive and time-consuming research. This brings up the question of whether or not someone is a quote-unquote bad person for eating foods that were produced from slave labor. The answer is no, because there is only so much a person can do before it negatively affects their own livelihood. The best solution to this is by doing all a person can do to avoid slave labor products without it negatively affecting their own life.
Ultimately, each person must decide for themselves which is the higher price, the extra cost for guilt-free chocolate or the moral price for guilt-free chocolate.